job in analytics? Maybe I better not even ask. Oh, there's people watching online. If you are offering jobs in analytics like Candy, raise your hand if your company has a job. So we have a posting here. Marketing analytics at Jobber. That could be fun. They have a nice office right on Jasper. Anyone else? All right, you can go to the Lunchalytics website, click on the job board, and either post or apply for jobs there in the analytics space. Target-rich environment. Okay, and I'm looking for the thumbs up still. Thumbs are up. So welcome to Lunchalytics 39. This is the most popular Lunchalytics we've had thus far. I think we had over 30 people on the wait list, perhaps thousands viewing online even as we speak. Our first speaker is Ganesh. Oh, I'm going to kill your last name. Murdeshwar. And he's going to be talking about backup goalies using Bays. I love this. And I'm not going to take any more time, so take it away.
Do you have a slide clicker? Or... Okay, perfect. All right. Thank you, Dan. Thanks for having me back, and thanks everyone for being here and eating lunch and listening. Yeah, so what I want to talk about today is the Oilers' backup goalie situation. It's perhaps a moot point for this season since it's somewhat of a lost season, but there are some decisions that need to be made on the personnel involved. And so in addition to it being an interesting problem to tackle, it's a nice platform for introducing Bayesian analysis. So quick question, how many people are really familiar with Bayes? Like you use it for inference, you understand the math behind it, that kind of thing? Okay, just a few. How many have heard of Bayes but don't really know what it's all about? Okay, good. So the group that raised their hands second and the group that didn't raise their hands, you're my audience today. Okay, so I'm going to go through an introduction to the concepts behind Bayes. No math, but introductions nonetheless. And the people who raise their hands first, you can keep me honest. Okay, so here's the challenge to take the generic question of the backup goalie situation and turn it into some questions. Our challenge is to come up with reasonable answers to the following two questions. What exactly do the Oilers have in Laurent Brossoit? Okay. There's some decisions to be made if the Oilers don't give him a couple more games. He's going to be a UFA and will walk for nothing. Okay. And secondly, did the Oilers actually improve their backup goaltending when they switched from Brossoit to Al Montoya? I did not get a quote from either goaltender before this talk. And if you remember the controversy of back, it's an inside joke. Okay, next. Okay, so challenge number one, 3 clicks, please. It's actually really easy to figure out why Laurent Brossoit was sent to the minors. It's captured in these 3 numbers. This is his saves. This is all situations. That's how many shots he faced. And then you end up with an 89.9% save, or 89.9 save percentage, which just isn't good enough for an NHL goalie. So it's pretty obvious why he was sent down. Now the problem is when you want to take this and run some inference and say, well, what does that tell us about Brossoit's future as an NHL goalie? One more click. Then you run into this number, which is 27, which is not Milan Lucic. It's the number of games that Brossoit has played. Okay, and from what we know about goalies, their voodoo, their variance game to game is incredible. That's just not enough in the way of data for us to be able to say anything about Brossoit. So we're going to put up our hands and say, small sample size, we can't really say anything. Click. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't find that a very satisfying answer. Okay, and if you think about it, yeah, 27 games, history suggests that's not nearly enough. But we have almost 700 NHL shots of data on this guy. We have to be able to say something about him, about his capabilities as a goaltender, right? If you put me in front of 700 NHL shots, after the first one hit me, there'd be an empty net and the rest of them would be goals. So guaranteed this says something about his capabilities as a goaltender. Okay, so that gives us a nice little launch into what and why Bayesian analysis. Bayes is actually the new hotness in the sense that it's being talked about a lot. I was at the inaugural Lunchalytics Calgary last month, and all 3 speakers mentioned Bayesian analysis as part of their analytics process. Okay, it's pretty well established in data science actually, but really it's in its infancy in hockey. You won't see it used very often at all, and where you do see it used, it's used quite badly, to be honest. So the new hotness is actually the old hotness in that sense, because Bayesian approaches actually predate the kind of statistics we use. It's just that using Bayes properly requires a fair bit of computing horsepower, and in the 1700s when they invented this stuff, the computers they had there were not very fast. So we kind of had to wait until the computing caught up to the concepts, and now it's pretty widespread. There's a lot of reasons why Bayes has become popular, but the 2 that are going to be particularly useful to us, number 1 is that with Bayesian analysis, you can draw pretty reasonable conclusions even with really small sample sizes. Okay, and in the real world, small sample sizes are sometimes all that we have to deal with. Okay, and then the second thing is, and this will be more clear with the second challenge, is that the outputs from Bayesian analysis, the interpretability of it is a lot higher than with traditional statistics. It's really easy to misinterpret what p-values are, for example. I could ask 100 people that use p-values and statistical tests, and they would probably explain wrongly what p-values are 90% of the time. Okay, it's really easy to misunderstand what they are. Okay, so before we tackle the issue of Laurent Brossois' small sample size, I'm going to give you an even more challenging thought experiment. What if we had no sample size? So, one more click. What about if we took on the challenge of trying to predict a goalie with no NHL history? So I point you at a goalie starting tonight for the first time ever. What is that player going to do in his career? Okay. Now, that's a pretty unreasonable question, but if you were to take on the challenge, you might say something like 0.915 all situations save percentage. Pretty reasonable guess. It's kind of in the middle. It's not too high. It's not too low. Okay, and we let that goalie play his career, and we go back and revisit. The goalie got a 914 career save percentage. Okay, your answer is probably going to be, I nailed it. Okay, 914, 915 is pretty much the same. If you got a 910 or a 920, you might say, yeah, you know what? I was in the ballpark. That's not too far off the reality. If you're out at 905, 925, you're going, yeah, okay, I'm pretty far out. And once you get past those boundaries, you're going, yeah, I missed it completely. Okay, so that process that I just kind of went through, where you pick a number, you're not actually picking a number, right? You're picking a center point, and there's kind of this slope around it of, you know, the farther away you get from that, the less right you think you are. Okay, so being the unreasonable guy that I am, I keep pushing you, and I say, no, I want more specificity than that. And you do a little bit of research on how new goalies who enter the NHL do, and you come back to me with this, and you say, okay, I took a look at the last 10 years, and it turns out that, you know, in this range from 0.88, which is a really terrible goalie, to 0.93, where you're talking about really elite goalies, you kind of see this distribution. About 15% of them are going to be a cup of coffees and they're gone. And then you get an awful lot in this kind of middle area. And then as you get into good backups and starters, it gets more and more rare. Okay. Does that, is this a reasonable answer to an unreasonable question? Anyone want to nod their head or shake their head? If you think this is a reasonable answer to that unreasonable question, then congratulations, because you are now Bayesian. Okay. The process that we just went through, I kind of give it away with the title. We've created a Bayesian prior distribution. Before we've seen any data on on the specific goalie that we're looking at, we're taking a guess based on history. It's called empirical Bayes, as a matter of fact. And this approach where we slice it up into pieces is called gridwise approximation, but it's a legitimate way of tackling this question using Bayes. Okay, so great, you think it's legitimate, it's Bayes. So what? What do we do with it? Okay, and that's when we get into the interesting stuff. So now that we have a prior, what Bayes' theorem actually lets us do is it lets us take a prior and it lets us take observed data and we run it through Bayes' theorem, which is that thing in neon in the middle, and it gives us an updated set of probabilities that are consistent with the observed data. In this case, if you are an expert in Brossois trivia, you'll know that 49 of 51 is actually the numbers from his very first game with you others. 49 saves on 51 shots against San Jose. Okay, so you take this reasonable prior, you take the observed data, you run it through the formula, and you get this. And this is called a posterior distribution. Critics of Bayes call it a posterior distribution because they think we're pulling numbers out of our butt, but that's not the case. These are supportably rigorous numbers. Okay, and what happened? It took that distribution that we had prior to seeing a single game from Brossois, and now it's markedly shifted him into more optimistic territory, as you'd expect. 49 out of 51 is a pretty spectacular performance for a goalie. We're now a whole lot more optimistic about it. Okay, so great. So that's the prior. You can see I just put it there so you can see how dramatically it shifted. Okay. Now we call it updating because there's a certain dynamic aspect to the word updating, because it doesn't stop there. Okay. As we get more data, we can continue to adjust the probabilities that we've got with that new data. The key is that in each case, the previous posterior distribution from the previous prior and the previous data becomes our prior distribution for the new data. So we take that posterior after one game, now becomes our prior. We roll in the observed data. In this case, this is his Brossois' 2015 season. We run it through Bayes' theorem and we get this. Okay. 2015 was not a good season for Laurent Brossois. And so you'll notice now the numbers have again shifted quite far to the less optimistic side, the more pessimistic side. Okay. And we do that again. This is after 2016, which was an excellent season. And again, you start to see a shift over to the right. Notice that even though it was an excellent season, it hasn't shifted way over to the right like it did after the first game. That's because it's now incorporating all of the history. As in the early days, things shift quite far, pessimism, optimism, based on the observed data that you see. But notice that things are starting to kind of grind towards the middle. And then we do it again, or finally, maybe. So this is at the point where Laurent was sent back down to the minors, okay? So this is what that prior distribution that we built before seeing any data, and this is what that looks like after running all of his games through Bayes' theorem. We get this set of probabilities, okay? Now, here's my question to you. Is this at least a more satisfying answer to the question, what do we have in Laurent Brossois, than small sample size, sorry, can't do anything? Right? Can I assert that? Is that a fair assertion? Okay, so great. This is the essence of Bayes. We've now done a full Bayesian end-to-end estimation. Okay, Bayes now suggests, based on the prior that we had, that this is our best guess as to what Laurent's future looks like. Actually, it's our best guess as to what he is today, and therefore our best guess as to what he's going to be, at least in the short term. Okay. Now, again, great, but that's not very useful. It turns out that with the things that we're interested in hockey, a lot of them are proportions, right? Save percentage is a proportion, shooting percentage, Corsi for percentage, goals for percentage. And when you have percentages, you don't have to rely on this piecewise grid approximation. You can actually model it with a smooth distribution called a beta distribution. And that looks like this. Okay, so basically the same prior and the posterior for Brossois' career running through the same Bayesian updating process. Okay. What's neat about this distribution now is you can start to ask some more detailed questions about it. And the anatomy of this chart, when you're seeing any kind of Bayesian analysis, you will see a chart, generally speaking, that looks a little bit something like this. Okay, it's a probability distribution, and you'll typically get a midpoint highlighted, and you'll get two extremes highlighted, which is the 95% credible interval. It's typically what's used, and that's an analog to the 95% confidence interval in traditional statistics. My charts usually include a second set of numbers, which are they're kind of conceptually the equivalent to the one standard deviation. They encompass about 67% of the middle probability, which I think is more valuable for use in hockey. But that's just a me interpretation, not necessarily wide Bayes. But now we've got some really interesting results for Brossoit. So if you go to the next chart, now we can get some pretty satisfying answers, I think, because we can query this distribution. We can ask, at this point, what do we see as the most likely outcome for Brossoit? It's in that range, and that's that 67% in the middle. What's the surprising range? By surprising, meaning if it's better than that or worse than that, then we'll be surprised. But anything in that isn't that surprising. Okay. You can also ask questions that relate to the nature of the probability distribution. What's the likelihood that Brossoit is a career minor leaguer, meaning his save percentage is going to be under 905? It's actually 63%, which is kind of depressing. Okay. Or you can ask a range. What's his likelihood he's going to be a good backup? It's about 17%. And what's the likelihood he's going to be a starter or better, so 920 or better? Around 2 to 3%. Okay. Not so encouraging, but again, I will now assert to you that this is a much more satisfying answer than small sample size. Fair? You're not all Bayesians, so congratulations. Okay, so that is my hopefully satisfying to you as well answer to the question number 1 from our challenge. What about challenge number 2? Okay. Now, what's neat about it is that what I just described, where we started with a prior and then we updated with actual observed data, we can do the same thing for Al Montoya. This is, I've deliberately put this on the same scale as the chart for Brossoit because I want to emphasize to you exactly, there's vastly more data. Montoya's played a lot more games. So there's vastly more data on him. So our certainty about who he is much tighter. So you get a curve that is squished and high, okay? So if you click one more time. So if we stretch that out and say, okay, this is a little bit more readable of a chart, but it's the same information. Now we can run the same process for our expectations based on his historical data. What do we expect to see out of Al Montoya going forward? Our nailed it range, the range where we're absolutely not surprised if he ends up there, somewhere between 905 and 913. The well sorta, the range where if he's outside of that, we'd be surprised, 0.9 to 917. Probability that he's a minor leaguer going forward, about 18%. That's below 905. It's higher than I would like. The probability that he ends up being a solid backup is about 41%. Unsurprising, I think. That's the most kind of likely outcome based on his history. And this is an interesting one. The probability of him being a starter, based on this prior and his history, is less than 1%. Even though his established performance is considerably better than Laurent Brossoit's, we have a much better sense of who he is. We don't have a good sense of who Brossoit is. So the possibility exists still that Brossoit is going to be a starter. And that probability is actually still a little bit higher than Montoya, who we can be pretty sure is not going to be a starter caliber goalie going forward. Okay? So if you click to the next one, so if we want to compare these two directly, we can overlay it. There's a bunch of ways you can solve for this, but the easiest way is one line of Python or R code. You can take these two distributions, sample them 100,000 times, and compare the results. Basically, you're creating 100,000 universes and letting Montoya and Brossoit face off against each other. And then you just say, well, how often did Montoya outperform Brossoit in that situation? Turns out it's about 76% of the time. Okay, and you can translate that and say, in other words, as we sit today, based on what we know from their historical performance, we have 3-to-1 odds that the Oilers have improved their backup goaltending in the move from Brossoit to Montoya. Okay, now notice that's kind of a very real. Most people can understand odds. Notice that we didn't talk about a statement of our hypothesis. We didn't talk about selecting a statistical test. We didn't talk about worrying about sample size or power considerations. And we didn't have to set a critical value and then try and test, assess a p-value against that. None of that. Very real world, highly interpretable terms that we can use very readily without being an expert in statistics. Okay. All right. So to recap, we had two challenges. We wanted to get a sense of who Laurent Brossoit is going forward, and did the backup goaltending improve? For a lot of reasons, Bayes is a very natural fit to try and answer that. And the process that we went through today, we created a reasonable prior distribution. Then we updated it with the observed data for both goalies. And then we drew conclusions from the resulting posterior distributions. That is a basic Bayesian analysis process. The answers to our challenges, number one, now, Brossoit is not done. He's still early in his career, but his chances of being a starter are fading. If it were mine to decide, I would give him the games needed to keep his rights and maybe continue to invest. But in all honesty, you plan for a non-Brossoit post-Talbot future. And number two, hey, at least we have 3-to-1 odds that the Oilers have improved their goaltending situation with this move. Whether Montoya is good enough in that situation is a slightly different question, maybe slightly less positive, but at least we have some reason to believe that the Oilers' backup goaltending will be better because of the move. Okay? And that is it. We covered a hell of a lot of ground in about 20 minutes, so I hope I haven't left you overly confused or head spinning or anything else. Thank you for your attention, and happy to take any questions. Do we have time today?
One or two questions, sure.
Perfect.
Yeah, can you talk about the what you assume to be constant around this analysis? Because the Oilers are, the only thing constant is the Oilers are traditionally poor performing.
Yes.
They're really flaky on D.
Yeah.
Farmer David said that he's bewildered why game to game different teams show up.
Yeah.
So how valid really is the save percentage as a measure for goalie for this kind of team?
So really excellent question. I'm going to separate it into two. One aspect is a challenge that we have in hockey no matter what, which is that unlike a lot of forms of what we call good science, we don't have the luxury of running RCTs, right? Randomized controlled trials, where we split things, try and make them equal, and then apply a treatment so that we have a sense of what the difference is. And we can, in that case, we can clearly draw a conclusion about causality. In hockey, all we have is observed data. We don't have the luxury of doing RCTs. So that's always a problem when it comes to doing any kind of statistical analysis, is you have to account for the fact that this is purely observed data. And so you have to be very cautious about the how sturdy you conclude based on the data, just because of that underlying variability. The second question, if you want to go one slide forward, I try and anticipate questions. So he's not a plant, by the way. He didn't ask the question deliberately. So what I gave to you was very much simplified. I mean, in all situations, save percentage is a useful stat because it reflects your real world performance. But that's not what you'd use in an analytical situation. It's deliberately simplified for the purposes of trying to present the whole thing in 15 minutes, right? If I were to do this in a real model, at the very least, I'd want to use a better statistic that accounted for things like shot locations and shot types and the quality of the defense in front of the goalie. I'd want to model the states separately, right? 5-5, 4-4, and PK save percentage separately. And then that's useful in and of itself to see how the goalie performs in each one of those situations. And then if you wanted to tie that back into a single performance measure, you'd want to model TOI to weight it appropriately. And then I'd also want to model some sort of aging curve, because in the outputs that I showed you, in fact, here's Brossoit's range. We should actually expect that he's going to do towards the top end of that range, because he's still a young goalie. He's still got lots of experience in front of him. Al Montoya is 33. So whatever range we see based on his historical data, we probably are going to see towards the lower end of it, because he's on that part of the aging curve. So I'd want to model that as well. So this is kind of the bare minimum. If a team came to me and said, I want you to build a Bayesian model for evaluating goalies, this is kind of the minimum standard that I'd apply for real world purposes.
Time for one more question.
And then if you did model separate scores, would you use like a linear regression to get the weights on them for your single score, or what would you? And then you form one Bayes, or what would be your approach there?
You could potentially, actually, that would probably be a good way of doing it. In fact, what's interesting is you can use Bayes to solve for linear regression. So you can actually treat each one of the parameters in a linear regression as a Bayesian variable, and then use inference to solve for it. It's really quite interesting. So yeah, overlying this would have to be a model that combines these two, and my starting point would certainly be linear, because unless it proves to not work, simple is always better.
All right, we'll have to cut it there. Thanks very much, Ganesh. I'm sure Ganesh will stick around, so if you have those detailed questions, he can answer them for you. Our next speaker is oh, wait. I think you're muted.
I don't think. Am I good now, Dan? Can anyone hear me? Hold on.
Tyler, you're good.
Okay, I hear you. Good. All right. Thanks. Someone will tell me, I'm sure, if you can't hear me. It's very strange presenting this way. First time I've ever done it. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Tyler Dello. I used to have a blog about hockey analytics that started a few years ago, back in about 2005, 2004, right before the Oilers had the great run to the Stanley Cup final. And that blog and a few other blogs, blogs by guys like Tim Barnes and whatnot, sort of became the basis of one corner of hockey analytics development over the next 6-7 years, and then more and more voices came in, and it's much more diverse now. So for me, it got to the point where in about 2012, 2013, I started doing some media stuff, and then in 2014, they had what Bob McKenzie, who's very good at branding, labeled the Summer of Analytics, and part of that was Kyle Dubas going to the Leafs, and various other teams hired people. And for me, I ended up going to work with Dallas Eakins and the Edmonton Oilers for about 3 months. And Dallas was subsequently let go. I spent some time, doing some other stuff with the Oilers, and I'm now working for a startup called The Athletic. I'm obliged to promote it whenever I talk in public. James Myrtle will get upset if I don't. If you're interested in The Athletic, just talk to me and I'll make sure you can get a discount. You can try it out. It's a startup media company. So Dan has asked me to speak today sort of about lessons that I learned during my time being inside hockey, and I guess more than that, in performing basically a data role in an industry that historically is not very data oriented. And I reflected on that a little bit, and I've kind of come up with 3 observations, or more than 3, I guess, a few observations, both from the perspective of the person who's doing data work, and from the perspective of the person on the other side who's maybe got industry specific expertise, but for whom data is foreign, or for whom this way of thinking is foreign. And these are kind of some observations that I have based on my time doing this, both with the Oilers or talking to other people I know who are dealing with these challenges in the sports industry. And I've tried to make it applicable, not just to sports. So the first one for me is if you're a data person, really don't assume that anybody knows what the hell you're talking about. And I think that it's hard to understand how important that is, or important is the wrong word, but it's hard to understand how the level that people might not be at. And I'll give you guys an example of this. So in 2015, after Dallas had been fired, I ended up going to Sloan that year, and it was funny. Like Dallas kept texting me saying, you know, what's this Sloan? What's this Sloan? And finally, he was like, you know, my girlfriend was like, just tell me she come. So he came. And it was interesting because we were sitting in a presentation someone was doing about clutch scoring. And it was a bit of a wonky presentation, but there was a scatter plot. And I'm sure for most of you in this room, scatter plots are very intuitive. You look at it, you know what's going on. And we're looking at this, and Dallas leans over to me and he goes, you know, 6 months ago, I wouldn't have known what this meant. And I found that interesting because he's a smart guy, and he's motivated and he's ambitious. But it wasn't a way of presenting information with which he was really intuitively familiar. And, you know, I've kind of since then, you know, sort of tried to show some simple graphs and plots sometimes to people who are well-educated or who I know to be bright people, but who aren't data people, just to get their feedback on it. And I've always been struck by the frequency with which I'm told I don't get this. So, you know, one thing that I've taken from it is I try to, whenever possible, simplify what I'm doing and to explain it clearly and not assume that anybody has any experience with something, you know, even if they're sort of bright, accomplished people. That's the first point. Second one is learn to express your ideas in the way that they think. And I think this is an issue that the data people have sometimes. And I'm not going to name any names, but I'll give you an example. Like there's a player who hockey analytics people love, and I know Dan loves, you know, this player. Dan Haight does, and you know, I know some hockey people who've come around on this player who really like him as a result, not necessarily of being told that numbers people like him, but that kind of made them reconsider the player. And I, you know, and you know, like what I eventually heard about the guy was, quote, he's always making plays. And it was interesting to me because it suggests a way that you can kind of compress, you know, compress the process of taking the data and convincing the decision maker or the non-data person, if you could have put it more in their language right from the beginning. So if you could have said, okay, you know, this guy has great numbers. Here's why we think he might have great numbers. You know, what do you think? And by kind of engaging the numbers or converting the numbers into the way that the decision makers or the traditional people think, I think you'll find you can, you know, bridge gaps more quickly. Third point, yes, and this is, you know, I really think that people should be eager to learn as much as you can from people who are subject matter experts, but who aren't data people. And, you know, don't assume just because somebody says something and it sounds strange, you know, or it doesn't necessarily fit with the framework or model that you've developed, that it's wrong. And I think there's a lot of this that goes on, and there shouldn't necessarily be. And again, like another example of this for me, of this phenomenon. So one of the people with whom I worked while I was working for Dallas was Craig Ramsey. And Craig Ramsey, you know, he is, I would say he's not a data guy. You know, it's not his background. He was a high-end hockey player. And it was interesting. We were talking one day about a player, and Craig says to me, he goes, he changes like a pro. And what he meant was this guy, you know, he didn't stay on the ice to quote unquote, or not, this is a phrase a friend of mine used, to get his cookie. Like when the puck went up ice and it was close to being time for him to go, he always went and changed. So there's some interesting, and it was interesting, like, you know, like hearing that from Craig, and, you know, I sort of thought on it, and it's something I thought about now for a few years. And it's impacted how I look at some things because, you know, I know now that there are players who I think change differently than other players. And that was a case where, I took the expertise that Ramsey had accumulated during his time, his 40 years around the game. And I was able to take that and apply it to sort of the framework that through which I look at the game and be better at it, because I wasn't sort of disregarding what Rammer said because of his own, because he's coming from a different background. So those are sort of 3 points I have for, I guess, data practitioners. Going the other way, so this is, I guess, more for people on the other side of the equation, but engage with the ideas that, your people bring you. So if you're working with an analytics person, don't just go, okay, this is what you think, okay, but you should almost interrogate them on it and push back and try and force them to put it into the language of your business, whatever that might be, and see if you can't take what they've come up with and either refute it or develop an even better solution. And I've seen instances of that happening where I could show something with data and it would get interrogated, or there would be pushback, and we come up with a better solution as a result. And you're not going to get that though if you just go, okay, the nerd thinks this. You'll get that if you're having sort of the healthy kind of back and forth, but you're not going to have that if the person's in a silo. By sort of integrating them and treating them as anybody else who's involved, I think you'll find you get better results. And then just the final point that sort of stuck with me that I think would be, probably useful, is I sort of, allow for the unexpected. And one of the things that was good for me about working for Dallas, or that I found interesting, was I sort of said to him very early on, I was like, so what do you want me to do? And he goes, well, we have a few things that we know, I want you to do, but he goes, I also want you to sort of tell me what you should be doing. And I found that very kind of helpful, because it sort of encouraged me to look for ways where I could find information that was useful to him. And, I think I did some of that, and I know he's taken some stuff and gone on and had some success with it. So I think if you're somebody, again, working with data people, there's value in not just putting questions to them, but sort of asking them more broadly, where do you think that the processes you use or the processes you've come up with, where do you think you should be digging into what we do? So those were kind of my my 5 takeaways from my 2 years in pro hockey. And if anyone's got any questions and I'm able to hear them, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Tyler. Can you hear me right now?
I can hear you loud and clear, Dan.
Excellent. So if anyone has any questions, just raise your hand and I will come to you and we will try to figure out the echo.
It's a feature.
Well, I will ask a, oh, there's one. Oh, you got one.
No.
Okay. Hello. Yeah. I was wondering if you could just do a summary of your 5 points. There was some really good stuff there.
Hold on. I can't.
Hold on just one second. Tyler. I can't see you.
I can't unmute.
Guys?
You're good now.
Okay.
So did you hear that? He was asking for a summary of the 5 points. Really appreciate.
Yeah. Now, am I muted again? Good God. Okay. Yeah. So the summary of 5 points. 1, don't assume anyone understands what the hell you're talking about. 2, learn to express your ideas in the way that the industry people, for lack of a better term, think. 3, refine your own internal framework with feedback from those industry people. So when you're getting some sort of a point from them, really chew on it and ask whether you can improve your framework by incorporating that thinking somehow. 4, and this is from the industry person or the person interacting with the analytics person's point of view, engage with the ideas that your data people bring to you. And by that, I mean, don't just sort of say, okay, thanks for the results, but really try and understand why they think what they think. I think that means it works better for you, and you might end up getting better analysis from them, so everybody wins. And then finally, it's I call this expect the unexpected, which I know is occasionally a phrase in Edmonton hockey circles, but allow for the unexpected. And by that, what I mean is ask your people, say, give them some room to kind of explore questions that maybe you haven't come up with. And don't just assume that, they should apply themselves to problem A, B, C. Give them some room and some space to sort of just be aware of what's going on within the organization and consider how they might be able to come up with some ideas to help you. So those are the 5 points. I'm not hearing. Oh.
Hey there, Tyler. What would you say is the biggest challenge facing hockey analytics right now that no one has really cleverly solved? And is there some war-like statistic, like in baseball, that's being worked on, to your knowledge, for, say, a D or a forward or a goalie?
Well, there's a million war-like statistics. I'm not a big fan of the war statistics. And I think the problem is that on the level of data that we currently have, and so this is sort of the real-time scoring system data, I don't think you can necessarily parse out the contribution between the players. And I think a lot of the war models that you've seen, they have some really strange results in them. Or, you get guys who are sort of building them by machine learning or whatever, and they're sort of totally contradicting things that we're pretty sure are true from other studies. So I'm not sure that right now that's anything but a giant red herring. Like, I'm more interested in, understanding how the game kind of works and understanding where you can find value in terms of, why one team's better than another team. I think data is the big thing. That'll be the big step forward, is tracking data. When do we get tracking data available? And once we do, the teams that are able to figure that out the quickest, I think, will have a real advantage. And that's the point where maybe you'll start to see an effective war model.
We have time for just one more question. At the back.
Hi, Tyler. Big fan. Love the way you handled the Twitter trolls back in the Mick hockey days. My question relates to the Oilers' current regime. In your experience, how open-minded would you say the current Oilers management are towards statistical analysis or statistics-driven decision-making?
I think there's people there who are very open-minded. It's a tough question to answer. I don't like to talk too much. Like, it's one thing to talk about Dallas. I don't like to talk too much with the other people there. There's a lot of very bright people there working very hard, and I'm sure they'll figure it out.
Tyler, thank you very much. We appreciate it, and we'll hopefully have you again next year, maybe even in person. So thanks again.
Living the dream. All right. Good talk to you. Take care, everyone.
Back out of the wormhole. And I can use this. All right. Surprise guest is me. I'm going to talk about analytics and the draft, because I was going to talk about shootouts in Bayesian, because I heard that Ganesh was going to talk Bayesian. I thought it'd be so cool to have 2 bases in a row. But instead, I'm going to talk more simple analytics. And here, why don't you just, I'll be my own clicker. So here are my 5 ways to use the analytics in the draft. Number 1, choose goalies wisely. Number 2, don't be fooled by size. Find gems, exercise pick discipline, and trade down. 5 ways, just in the draft alone. Because really, for the Oilers, the draft is our Stanley Cup, right? So let's dig deep. So let's talk about goalies. Goalies. And this is my very, very simple math on goalies. If you just looked at goalies' save percentage in junior or in their draft year, maybe normalized it so that each league had a similar range. So say you're playing in a college league where the best save percentage is 940 and another goalie is playing in the WHL where the best save percentage is a 915. You'd find a way to make them comparable, maybe take percentiles or something. But you'd find if you picked goalies with a save percentage, say in the bottom 90% or with a 909 and lower, only 3 of the 210 goalies that were drafted became starters in the NHL. So that's pretty bad. But of the 116 goalies drafted with a save percentage 910 or above, we've had 15 starters. So maybe goalies aren't voodoo after all, and that there's some signal in the noise of their save percentage even before they come to the NHL. And I'm sure Ganesh would agree. Let's talk about size. This is the largest and the smallest person in the league, Nathan Gerbe and Zdeno Chara. And don't let the size confuse you, right? Okay, so just looking at defensemen. The percentage of defensemen who became core players, which if you're at my talk last year, I defined, just looking at defensemen who are 6 feet tall and under in their draft year, if they're taken in round 1, 80% of those become core players in the NHL. Round 2, about 30%, round 4, 40%, and then 5%, 18%. So it kind of bounces around a bit, but much better than your odds if you're picking a 6'3" and over. Now, this is the trick. Causation and correlation are not the same thing, and what this is showing us is selection bias. There's selection bias in the NHL. You always take the big guy, right? Because big guys help you win. It's a big man's game. You can't teach size, right? So I then compared this to just your kind of raw odds of getting a core player in any round in the draft. Man, those 6 foot and under defensemen, they do pretty well. You shouldn't be afraid to pick a small player. And you're starting to see that now. Even the Oilers picking a very height challenged player last year with their first round pick. And he may turn out to be a fantastic player. And then here's why I think it's happening. So this is the percentage of players who score more than 65 points per game and are picked. 0.65 points per game. 65 would be a lot. Those defensemen who are under 6 feet tall, 4 to 5 of them taken in the first 2 rounds were scoring at a pretty high rate. And that's why. But look at, if a defenseman makes it past the first round, a big guy, he still gets picked a lot of times, but he's never scoring. The big guys that score, they all get snapped up pretty quick. So really what we're seeing is, well, he looks like a defenseman. He skates like a defenseman. He's got the hockey sense, but he just can't score. But he's got the other 5 tools, so we got to take him, and that's why we have such an abysmal rate in the later rounds. Okay? The third way, I said, was to find the gems. And last year I gave you lists upon lists upon lists of all the players taken in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th rounds that turned into core players for their respective NHL teams, meaning every team passed over them multiple times. So how do we find the gems? I could talk about that for hours and hours and hours, but I think this is interesting. There's about 8 players taken later in the draft each year. And the average height of those players is 5'10". A third of them are from the Canadian junior leagues. About 1 in 8 or 1 in 7 are from Sweden. And almost half of them are defensemen. Compare that to the anatomy of a bust, which would be a player taken in the first round who doesn't turn out. They tend to be tall, taken from the OHL and the W. Most of them are forwards and are actually about equal to what the league is when you're choosing players. So you can see how size bias is a big part of it's a big inefficiency in the draft, And that shows up in finding these underappreciated players. And I always like to put this in the language that people can understand. Skating can improve after the draft, right? We know that. Zach Parise famously taught himself to skate fast because in junior he could get away with just dingly dangling around everyone, but in the NHL he had to learn how to skate fast, and he still became a star. Scoring does not improve when you join the NHL unless you just didn't have opportunity. If your coach said, I want you to play defense and you're a forward, or your coach said, you're never playing on the power play and I put you on the fourth line because I don't know you. So some players get hidden or buried behind great players on their team. And so it's not that their scoring improved, just their opportunity improved. And one player that, Milan Lucic was a player that falls into that category. His scoring rate was quite low in his draft year, I think 0.25 or 0.35 points per game, but he was playing on the third line. And he was not playing with good line mates, and all the good cherry power play time was going to the players in front of him. And so the next year, when he finally got to play still on his junior team after the draft, he scored at a really high rate once he was given more opportunity. And that was the gift that kept on giving for the Bruins, because everyone thought, see, you don't have to score well in junior to be awesome. We should draft all those big, tough guys. Which is, like I said, the gift that kept on giving for the Bruins, as everyone burned their draft picks trying to find another Lucic. Okay, and size does improve after the draft. The rumor has it that Pavel Datsyuk grew 3 inches after the draft, and we see it sometimes in the stats where it's like, when we drafted that player, he's 5'8", and now he's 5'11". How did that happen? They may grow, or they may just have shorter measuring sticks, and I think even if you look at anatomy, humans grow on average half an inch during their 17-year-old age. So players can still get bigger. Pick discipline is the last of my things. So what happens at the draft is you get excited. You get excited because this player that you wanted to pick is there, and it's like, we only pick once every 30 tries or 31 tries. We should, he's not going to be there for our second rounder. We should take him. And so if you look at how far a player is taken from the consensus, and I'll define consensus here as the TSN rankings, the Bob McKenzie rankings of where a player should be taken. So at the beginning of the year, these like, Connor McDavid's going first overall. If Connor McDavid fell to third overall, we would be shocked and appalled, would we not? But if someone was ranked, 31st overall and they fell to 35th, oh, just a little bit. So that's what we do, the percentage of falling. And there's the consensus, plus or minus 10%. There's a little bit of a slide or a little bit of a reach. And then there are the extremes. And what we see is when players slide down to you, so he was expected to go number 6 overall, and he fell to number 16, for instance, that's a sign that you should pick that player, because those sliders tend to do well. They have a higher hit rate than when you reach. If I stretch up and say, I'm picking 30th, this player should have gone at 50th, but I'm just going to take him at 30th anyway, then you end up in that over 30% reach, and that's a bad thing. It tends to not do well. And if you look at the 10 largest reach picks over the last, over a 10-year window, you can see a couple of them are probably core players in the NHL. Maybe Mark Jankowski will turn into a core player, but most of these players end up being kind of marginal at best. The converse of the 10 furthest slides, the guys that were ranked higher and slid down, Philip Forsberg, supposed to go number 3, drop down to number 11. Then there's the very famous player Matthew Barzal, expected to go top 6, slides down to number 16. Those are the players who end up becoming core players on their teams. All right. Oh, sorry. The last one is trading down. This is, I think that's the New York Islanders GM at pick number 16. So trading down is, remember last time we talked about this. This is where you find core players in the draft. Half of them are found in the first round. Your odds are 50% roughly. And then it's about 20%. And then it's about 7% per round. And if you trade down, you can turn that second or third round pick into a fourth and a fifth, or a fifth and a sixth, and I would just say third through seventh are pretty well identical. Your odds of getting a core player in any of those rounds are the same. So why would you hold on to your thirds and fourths if you could turn them into fifths and sixths, multiple fifths and sixths? So at most points on this curve, you're better off to trade down. And there, you can actually do the curve by pick itself, and you find some interesting things that picking 20th overall is like 20th to 25th is typically worse than picking like 28th and 29th. There's these weird discontinuities happen, and historically the 31st pick is just horrible. You should never pick 31st, which is usually the worst team in the league, their second kick of the can, and they've already picked a good skill player with number 1 overall, so now we need some toughness, and that's what happens. I'm going to tie this off by looking at Lou Lamoriello and kind of tagging on to what Tyler mentioned about how do you get what you do to be received and understood and respected by the people you're advising. So the problem with us analytics types is we are typically advisors. So we're not necessarily the doers. We're the ones telling the doers what to do and getting mad when they don't do it, right? Because we know what's right, but he's not going to listen to you. And remember, this is why. So here's the 2x2 matrix of what can happen in any analysis. Either the analysis is right or wrong, or the GM is right or wrong. And if we're both right, then it's the happy useless place. You should pick Connor McDavid with the first overall pick. Thanks, Dan. Thank you. Then there is the you might get fired spot where you're wrong and the GM's wrong, but he notices and he remembers that you were wrong. So you might get fired. Then there is the, you really might get fired when the GM's right and you're wrong. And then this is where we think we are all the time, right? Hey, we're right and they're wrong. That's where we think we're hanging out. Sometimes we are, sometimes we're not. That's where the value is available. So my advice to the GMs and the managers of the world and the decision makers of the world is when that nerdy person disagrees with you, push into that, dig into that, listen to that, because everyone else is going to do this. But if you listen in those moments when you disagree with that person, you will actually refine your results and you may actually find the big wins right there. Similarly, you as an analyst need to listen when the GM says, no, I don't think that works. And it will help refine your model. And I can give thousands of examples, well, at least hundreds of examples of where I have solved the wrong problem extremely well, or forgotten something in my data that I should have thought of, or something else went wrong. And by listening to the decision maker, I was able to refine it. And it comes down to skin in the game. Remember, who has to go in front of the cameras? Who has to go in front of shareholders? Who has to get fired when it all goes wrong? Typically, it's the GM, it's the decision maker, while you get to sit back there and wait for the new guy to come in and then advise them. So having skin in the game is important, and I suggest all of you should put your money on the line when you're making these kinds of recommendations. Say, if I'm wrong, fire me. Or if I'm wrong, cut my salary in half. If I'm right, give me a big bonus. It'll really help focus your analysis and reduce the number of mistakes. The last thing I'll just mention about this, particularly in things like the draft, but often in a lot of things we do in business, the connection between you are right and you are wrong and your recommendation. So the time from when I recommend to when I know whether I'm right or wrong is really long. It's longer than the average lifespan or the average career length of a general manager in a hockey team. So it's really hard to say if I was right or wrong, and what may seem wrong for a little while may turn to be right later on. And so that even makes it more difficult for there to be true accountability in these things, which is why you should do the betting markets as well to get even further skin in the game. So you can go in Vegas and you can bet on your decisions. So that's it. I will leave it open for any questions you might have. Covered it extremely well, didn't I? Oh, that's back.
It's like a follow-up question to your presentation. Have you seen any improvement in how the Oilers develop players were horrendous for 10 years. One pre-draft picks, I think, lineup.
Yeah, it's really hard to disentangle, whether it's the Oilers or any other team, how much is bad drafting and how much is bad development. You can probably pick one or two players and say, oh, they ruined Yakupov. I mean, come on, we can all agree. But if you go to any team in the league, they have those players. So I don't have a answer that would fit within the time we have here as to how you could disentangle, but I think you could begin to disentangle how much is development and how much is drafting. And I think it's high on the thinking of any team is, are we developing our players appropriately? The problem is you have misaligned incentives. If I'm a coach in the AHL, I'm not going to get a job in the NHL if I have a losing record, even if the team really wants me to play the young guys. If they're not good enough to play and I'm going to have a losing record, I'm out there to try and get an NHL job. I'm not out there to develop the marginal players as I see them for my team. So right there, you have a huge misalignment of incentives. And that happens all the way down the line. So next question.
And Tyler mentioned that he started off kind of 2004, 2005 analytics. Has anyone done any work on looking at the last, say, 12 years and then the previous 12 years? Like, have GMs been better because of analytics, or has the record been the same in terms of drafting? And has analytics had a made a difference?
So I don't think anyone's done that formal of a study going back that far. I think you could point to, and anecdotally, I think GMs themselves would say, oh my goodness, you should have seen us in the 90s, right? We played rock, paper, scissors to pick players. I think what you have been able to see is some of these recommendations I gave, you have seen other teams, you can see them doing them. And now we're starting to be able to close the loop and see the success that has come from them doing those things. Toronto famously trading down, half a dozen times during the 2015 draft and amassing a huge amount of talent, and now having almost too many skilled players, just an embarrassment of riches in their minor league systems. And there are other teams where you've seen kind of similar, Tampa comes to mind, and there's a few others who have heavily invested in analytics. And the fruit is starting to be borne out. Most of the time, they invest in the draft analytics. It's harder to convince coaches to change tactics. It's also harder to do analysis that will impact coaching. It's harder to, there's probably been some impact you can see in the trades that teams make, but, and some of that comes to mind in what Pittsburgh has done and who they've traded for leading up to their Stanley Cup wins. But it's not as obvious. A lot goes into those decisions, more than just the numbers. And sometimes the numbers say you should pick a player, and you pick that player and you put them on your team, and then the coach doesn't want to play them, or the coach wants to use them in a different way, so it doesn't work anyway. So there's a lot of issues like that.
Really fast one, hopefully. Earlier on, we were comparing the heights of players. I think it was 6'3" was the height you started at for.
Yeah.
How many players proportionally are like that tall? I guess not in that position, but is that a big sample size? I don't know. I'm a bit hockey naive, so maybe there are.
Right. So the average height in the NHL is, I think, 6'1". I think that's the average height of an NHL player. The average height of a player that is drafted is like 6'3".
Oh.
So you can see the bias right there, that the teams are picking players with a huge bias towards size, and that makes a big inefficiency. Yeah. All right. We will tie it off there. We have Lunchalytics coming, 2 of them next month, 1 in Calgary, and that's on energy analytics, and 1 in Edmonton. And I believe we have public safety analytics. Speakers still to be announced. So if you can talk about public safety and analytics, come talk to me. We're also looking for sponsors, and I always forget to look for sponsors, but if you'd like to sponsor, it pays for the wonderful food. Thanks to Dark Horse for sponsoring butter chicken from Remedy today. And, we'd certainly like to have you out for next month. And thanks to all our online viewers who bore with us online and didn't get the free food. Okay, thanks again. We'll see you next time. Oh, wait, whoa. There's a pop-up store on your way out, and they're selling food made with grasshoppers. Not by grasshoppers, with grasshoppers. And there's another one that is a guy that does anything. So check him out on your way out.